Hey, folks, welcome to the Battles of the First World War podcast. Joining me today is Peter Belmonte, a historian who collaborated with Alexander Barnes on their fourth and latest work, Bullets, Bandages, and Beans, United States Army Logistics in France in World War I. Alexander is unfortunately unable to join us this afternoon, so sorry we missed you, man. Alexander Barnes, however, was born in Niagara Falls, New York, and grew up in an Air Force family. He enlisted in the Marine Corps in 1974 and then joined the Army National Guard in 1977, retiring as a Virginia Army National Guard Chief Warrant Officer in 2004. He retired from the U.S. Army at Fort Lee in July 2015 after 30 years of service as an Army civilian, including deployments in Desert Storm, Bosnia, and Kuwait. He has a master's degree in anthropology and has authored or co-authored 9 U.S. military history books. He is currently serving as the command historian for the Virginia National Guard. And then we have Pete Belmonte is a retired U.S. Air Force officer and veteran of Operation Desert Storm. He holds a master's degree in history from California State University, Stanislaus, and has written several books, articles, and reviews. He's written 4 books with Al Barnes: Bullets, Bandages, and Beans, United States Army Logistics in France in World War I, United States Army Depot Brigades in World War I, Play Ball, Doughboys in Baseball During the Great War, and Forgotten Soldiers of World War I, America's Immigrant Doughboys. He is currently documenting the history of Italian immigrants in the U.S. military in the 19th century. So, Bullets, Bandages, and Beans is a book that years ago would likely not have piqued my interest. And that is because I was just an amateur history enthusiast with an eye only towards the combat side of conflicts. But now, hopefully with what is hopefully a more seasoned eye, I welcomed the opportunity to read and then discuss this book with the very man who wrote it. So while the story of the American Expeditionary Force's service of supply may not be as heart-stopping and exciting as tales of combat in the Meuse-Argonne, it is nonetheless just as fascinating. So consider this: the Herculean task of feeding a 28,000-man infantry division in the AEF. Think of all of the doughboys, from infantrymen to the ammo-trained guys in the rear, as well as all of the division's horses. Think of the amount of food needed for a day's worth of meals. Now, think of feeding that division every day for months and months and months. And think, too, that once the guns fell silent on November 11th, 1918, it's not like those doughboys didn't, stop needing to eat. They need to, obviously, they kept on having to be fed. So the work of the service of supply continued on after the war, as if nothing had changed, because for them, nothing had. Like, the job went on. So I really can't wait to dive into the book here. So, Pete, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me, Mike. I enjoy the podcast, and I'm very happy to be here and be on.
Awesome. So I've got a whole range of questions here. So what has sparked your interest in the Great War?
Well, I'll make a long, boring story into a short, boring story, I guess. And I've always been interested in military history. Early on, I was interested in the Civil War and World War II. And fast forward to the 1990s, and I'm doing some family research, some genealogical history research. And I go to Kenosha, Wisconsin, where my mother's family settled in the early 1900s. They have the library, downtown library, Simmons Public Library. Inside there, they have in the vestibule, they have a very nice memorial made in the 1920s with marble panels, and etched on there in gold is the name of every serviceman or servicewoman from Kenosha in the Great War in World War I. I think there's 3,000 of them. Anyway, as I'm looking through there, I noticed quite a few surnames that are either family names or that I know these names, these people. I started jotting them down and said, oh, that's interesting. And early on, I found out I was related to two of them. They were my great grandfather's cousin and my grandmother's cousin. And I said, well, you know what? I don't know anything about this. So I started researching that. And the more I read, the more I researched, I wanted to see what those units did. What kind of units were they? What is there anything I could find about those individual soldiers? And of course, it just grew from there. I kept reading and delving, and really I never turned back from there. So I wouldn't call it necessarily, it's certainly not a close family relationship. It's, a ex post facto, family connection. But that's prompted me and spurred me to keep researching.
Wow, that's cool. That's amazing. Like you come, like kind of your Air Force background and everything. You would think like, World War One. I mean, definitely the air service had its origins there, but I think that whole part's fascinating. So family connections, that's amazing. Now, as far as like yourself and Alexander getting into these like talking about the depot brigades and the logistics services, what's led you down this path of like the lesser known parts of the AEF?
Yeah, we early on, I don't even remember exactly how we met. I think each of us had written a book. I wrote one on a 26th Infantry Regiment in the Meuse-Argonne. He had written about the occupation forces in Germany, excellent 3-volume series. And I think we started corresponding. And we decided we were discussing the things we like. We were interested in the immigrants in the service. We were interested in baseball and how that played out with the Doughboys. And both of us were interested in kind of the support units. And I'd been doing a lot of research on depot brigades and development battalions in the United States. He had done a lot of research. In fact, I think he had a big manuscript on the logistics in France, SOS. And so from those kind of two separate, but actually we were kind of paralleling interests, that's how that developed. And we said, why don't we try? We did the depot brigade book first. And that went well, and so we moved right on to the SOS in France, and that's where we were, but where we're at.
Awesome. Just as a quick aside, the depot brigades, were those based in the U.S. or are you talking? Because I think I'm confusing.
Right. There's depot divisions; those were in France. These are depot brigade, and the book is actually not about just depot brigades. It's almost a misnomer. But it's about the U.S. military, mostly the Army, U.S. Army in the United States during the war. Depot brigades were part of that. They were at each cantonment, and that's where we got that from. Yeah,
cool.
But those are stateside units.
All right. Okay, and this is your fourth book together with
That's right.
with Al. So that's amazing.
Yeah.
All right. So I've got a quote here.
Yeah.
And it's so. The SOS, the Services of Supply for listeners. So the SOS was only in operation for a little more than 2 years, 17 months during the war, and the 8 or 9 months after the war that were needed to support the troops as they were sent back to the States, as well as to shut down the organizations and facilities of the American Expeditionary Forces. During that short period, there were more than 600,000 American soldiers in France working in the SOS, as well as thousands of French and British women, German prisoners of war, POWs, and a large number of Asian laborers and drivers. This was a period when Allied propaganda was telling the world that 10,000 American soldiers arrived in France every day. Left unsaid was that someone had to feed, shelter, pay, clothe, equip, and move those soldiers, as well as tend to their physical, moral, mental, and spiritual health, while integrating them into combat units that would provide them with the tools, weapons, and ammo needed for combat. And that someone was the Services of Supply. So if you would, Pete, can you tell us about the creation of the SOS and the AEF's admin areas in the war effort, from the zone of the interior, like all the way to the front line?
Right, and that's and is that just outline that you read kind of gives you an idea of what we were saying at the beginning. This stuff has to go on. It's not glamorous. It's usually not fun, but it has to be done. But let's look at overseas. The zone of the interior will be, of course, the United States.
Okay.
And then if we look at overseas, that was kind of divided into a couple of zones. You had the rear zone, which was itself divided into ultimately 9 base sections, each
Okay.
base section kind of having a port,
Okay.
and it's geographical sections. Then you had the intermediate section, which was in between that and the advanced section.
Okay.
And that's where items would be moved from the port areas, from the base sections into the intermediate section for sorting and storing, ready to go forward to the advanced section, which would then be, for example, a railhead at the edge of the advanced section where you get to the fighting area, the front lines, not right at the front lines, obviously, the rear areas of the front lines.
Okay, gotcha.
So that's kind of the 3 areas of behind the lines, if you will. And originally, it was called the lines of communications.
Okay.
And I believe the first man in charge of that was Major General Richard Blatchford in the summer of 1917. Well, he understandably had trouble getting this thing started. And let me just start by saying a lot of the problems were due to the United States' lack of preparedness for World War I.
Right.
Trained men, material, shipping, all of that. We're not prepared for that. And suddenly we're thrust into this, or we go into it. So Blatchford's having problems. He's soon replaced in 1917, I think the late summer or early fall, by Major General Francis Kernan. Kernan does a little better job. He's picking it up. It's eventually called the Services of Supply. For a while, I think it was called the Services of the Rear. They didn't like that. They went to Services of Supply. Kernan was eventually replaced by Major General Harbord, who we know, of course, had been commander of the Marine Brigade. He's an Army officer, James Harbord, but he's was commander of the Marine Brigade briefly during June, July, and then he becomes commander of the division and finally moves on. He didn't really want to go. Of course, he's a combat leader, a combat commander. He didn't want to go to the SOS, but he did go, and he did a fine job in kind of getting that all straightened out. And we get into more of that later. But so those are kind of the 3. Then there was General Haygood, who was also very capable, Johnson Haygood. And by the way, he wrote a memoir that's very worthwhile looking up if you're interested in this kind of thing.
Okay.
I forget what the name of it is. It's in the book. You can look in there. But
we'll look it up.
Yeah. And so Harbord and Kernan also deserves some, praise for getting this stuff kind of taken care of, getting the offloading, storing, shipping, categorizing, and then going to the front kind of in order.
Yeah. One little episode that I like that you guys mentioned is with Kernan. They wanted to send a replacement for him from Washington, but
yes,
if I'm correct, but Pershing being Pershing, considered the AEF was his and his alone, and so he very quickly puts Harbord in charge before Washington can do anything.
Yeah. So. It was going to be Goethals, Major General Goethals. I'm probably mispronouncing it, who's famous, of course, as an engineer and a civil engineer. And maybe that would have been a good choice. But the people, and you bring this out, of course, the people in Washington, especially when you get the general, the name, it just flew out bottom. Anyway, I'll get to it. They want to reach and hold on. They think, well, I'm in charge of that army. Ultimately, I want to control. And Pershing was, as you said, would have none of that.
Yeah.
So anyway, yes, that's so he got his man, and it was a good choice.
Yeah, amazing. So you got you got several men in charge of this, SOS, and you have a quote in here. I believe it pertains to Harbord, Harbord pretty much hit the ground running, and then had to start running faster. So I think you're absolutely correct. Due to the United States' general unpreparedness for the war, I don't think there was much experience in creating this massive operation, and then also the scale of it. Nobody in the U.S., we hadn't done anything on this scale since the Civil War, and even that was this World War I effort was many times larger than what we saw even in the
Yeah,
Civil War.
and shipped
So,
thousands of miles away, and yeah,
yeah, and now involving, traversing an ocean. So,
yes,
wow,
yeah.
just amazing.
And if I can go back, we talked about the unpreparedness.
Yeah,
Another issue is the issue or the problems of fighting a coalition war. Early on, as you know, the Allies had in mind that perhaps they wanted U.S. forces as replacements, or at the very least, augmentees for their own armies. And of course, that's going to be a political non-starter. It's also going to be, it's just not what Baker and Wilson had in mind, and not, of course, what Pershing was. His goal was an American army. To do that, to have an American army. I'm generally a pro-Pershing guy, notwithstanding, none of these guys, Pershing, Haig, Foch, none of them were used to hearing the word no. So
right.
they are what they are, and so Pershing rightly said, well, we need, in order to have an army, we need support people. We need the people to build docks. We need people to unload the docks. We need people to build trains, railroad tracks, construct facilities, warehouse facilities. Understandably, the Allies said, that's fine. We have some of that here. We need men with rifles and machine guns in their hands. So this was a constant dickering going back and forth. Ship over infantrymen and machine gunners first. Well, we'll do that if you give us this amount of tonnage. So this was all part of that, too. He couldn't get the men he wanted, although some of the early people going over were indeed various types of engineers, railway engineers and stevedores, dock workers, and things of that nature.
Yeah, amazing. So on top of like this nearly chaotic supply situation, you have, like, exactly like you said, like this coalition warfare of like, now let's complicate this a step more by having to work with our allies, like with the British, who provided, I think was it the British who provided like half of the ships to bring troops over. So
yeah,
a lot.
They did.
Yeah,
They provided, yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh,
We French and Italian also, but British were the main load as far as the Allies shipping us, helping us.
cool. So you've already mentioned some of the leadership in the services of supply. So did they have like a guiding philosophy? And thinking of a quote that's mentioned in your book, talking about the examples of the overcoats, the coats that the doughboys wore, like there's a quote in here that says like, hey, the guys on the front coat's going to last about 3 months. So, to account for that, you need to have one ready to be issued, a new one ready to be issued, one coming in, and like another one like being built, being sewn together, like back in the States. I'm paraphrasing, but
Yeah.
so what was like their guiding philosophy?
Yeah, you can almost look at it as, I don't know the phraseology nowadays, whether it's just-in-time supply or something like that, but that's
Yeah,
kind
gotcha.
of the thing. And another part of this philosophy was, we can't afford the shipping to send all this stuff from the United States, first of all, across the United States to the ports on the ship, over then forward. So when they could, they bought things and from our allies, and of course, we all are aware of the show rifles, and most importantly, the French 75s and other guns those were very successful, and of course, airplanes. We were going to darken the sky with airplanes, and we didn't quite do that. So not only those kinds of things, but we sought to buy material over there also. And we could talk about that a little bit more later on, because that would save on shipping space, so we can indeed send the men with the rifles and the machine guns over. And and that's interesting. We'll talk about that a little bit more probably later, but the way they did that, the way they tried to source things. We had men going to try to buy horses from everywhere, from France. Well, they're strapped, right? They're getting their own farm horses. So we're trying to buy them from them. We go into Spain to try to source horses. They're officially neutral, but we're trying to buy, and we do buy horses from Spain and things like that, and forage, like you mentioned earlier, all that. So yeah, try to save on shipping, I think, was a bit. And we'll talk about the salvage squads maybe later too, which
Sure.
I get a kick out of those guys too.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So when would a deploying doughboy first come into contact with the services of supply? Back in the U.S. or once they get on the ships, or like once they get off in France?
Yeah, yeah, and this here's where I'm sorry that Al's not. Well, I'm sorry Al's not here anyway, but he was going to take this part, the
Oh,
first part of
okay.
that. But that's okay. I got it. I got it. Yeah, technically, services supply the way we're talking about it starts in Europe. But yeah, from the minute he sets foot on the ship, things are being done for him. Things are being supplied to him that he needs for the for the ocean. Of course, food, which on some of the British ships was pretty bad, but and once they got to the United States, or I'm sorry, once they got to France, we're talking about France for the time being here. As soon as they set foot there, if if there were available, stevedores would begin unloading. Stevedores weren't always available. Sometimes they were detached. Certain men were detached from the unit to conduct the unloading.
Wow.
Their material was then stored at the dock. They had to march to a training or a rest quote rest area, right? And that was part of the services supply. The housing, the engineers working on the roads they traversed as soon as they got off the dock. That was part of the services supply. The railways that the 40 and 8s, oftentimes when they were on American run railways, that was part of the services supply. So yeah, really as soon as they set foot in Europe and they made their way from those zones, the rear areas, the base sections to the intermediate area to the advanced section, constantly dealing with the services of supply.
Was Camp Pontonazen, was that the largest transit camp?
I believe it was, and it was, initially it was terrible place. I think they made effort to try to get that a little bit better. I think it was, and again, this is another part we're going to discuss further, but I think it's an old cantonment, and I believe it was, back to Napoleonic era. But that was the largest. I don't know if there's anything left of it. I really have been trying to look a little bit and see if we could see what's there. They may have something, but I'm not aware of what's there anymore.
Yeah. Are you aware of any other AEF like base sections or camps or facilities that may have been repurposed at the end of the war and still exist?
You know what? To be honest, I don't know that. I assume that there were some because we had built up these docks in these areas. Some we leased and used from the French. So some of those were bound to be in continued use. And of course, we used them on the way out as we exfiltrated from there and shut down the base sections one by one until the Antwerp, I think it's Antwerp's last one.
Wow. Fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. So made mention of some French and British women working as well as Asian drivers and laborers. So could you talk about some of the foreign nationals that the AEF hired to help with its efforts, and in this, like, who are some groups of people that didn't work out so well?
Yeah, I'll start with those. The Russians, soldiers, that were used generally were troublesome and didn't work out very well. And as far as the Chinese, the British had Chinese labor companies. I think the Chinese people themselves are probably civilians led by British military, overseen by them.
Okay.
They always, called them coolies in the literature. Mm-hmm. And these men, we benefited from them also. And just this digression, I always get a kick out of the French colonial troops from Vietnam. They call them Annamese, Annamites, Tonkin, Chinese. They were men from Vietnam who were part of the French army, albeit the colonial, and they were driving. And they drove United States soldiers too.
Right.
And when you read them again, memoirs, you get some interesting, of course, tinged with the flavor of the times, discussions of these men. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. But yeah, and there were British women working for us, working for the United States. We had United States and American women came over. Of course, we had what they called hello girls, the operators who then subsequently were granted veteran status. Not at the time they weren't, I believe, and then it was subsequently after that. But I'm also thinking, as I was sleeping way ahead, I was going to talk about the garden service, and a lot of women from the United States volunteered to come over to be a part of this garden service and help grow vegetables and things like that for the soldiers. So. And German POWs also worked. Wherever we could obtain local labor, that would be good, because now I don't have to have an American soldier come back and oversee the supply, even though we did have obviously thousands and thousands of men doing that. And and civilians. But if we could hire a French civilian, it would help them and it would help us. So
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. And it probably helped building American-French relations and local relations with people being hired locally. And then, that money gets distributed back into the local economy and everything.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Cool. Cool. Yeah. So Russian soldiers didn't work out so well. German POWs, not too bad.
Not too bad. No.
French and British women worked out well.
Did well. Yep.
Vietnamese laborers. It's interesting. Even your book even mentions that even though they weren't supposed to, some of my people, the Portuguese, got hired in there.
Yeah, and they fielded I don't know how many divisions, at least a division, right? 2 divisions.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
They were in a very bad spot at one point, but
they were, those poor guys.
Yeah.
All right. So, God, we've mentioned a lot of this, but the next question I've got here on the line is some of the problems the SOS faced. I mean, my goodness. Yeah.
I guess what didn't they face, right? I mean, supply, again, it took a while for American industry to really get going on some of these things. So they faced that kind of thing. And another thing a problem with what I was going to discuss is a little bit of a morale problem because of what we discussed before. Well, it's not as comfortable to be an infantry soldier, but there's where the glory is. There's where the medals are, if that's what they're looking at.
Yep. There's
where something interesting is. But if you're unloading, if you're an African-American guy or a white man in the rear unloading something or heaving sacks of flour onto a rail car, that's not interesting. It's not fun. There's no glory in it.
Right.
So there was a morale, and later Harbord came up with these competitions. Which unit can unload the most, these kind of things. And that helped a little bit. And then later, of course, they had sports competitions and things like that. So that helped. And both Harbord and Pershing also mentioned that these men did the hard work that without which the fighting couldn't have been done.
Right.
They earned no medals, they get no accolades, but yet they did this hard work. And another problem, and I'll go back to the supply thing, and I want to touch on the salvage service, the quartermaster salvage service. They had a kitchen, and I'll read this here because it's interesting to me. They have a kitchen economies branch established April 14th, 1918. So what they wanted to do, and here's something not a lot of people think about, a big camp, front lines, rear areas, wherever, it produces a lot of stuff. A lot of it can be reused easily. Some of it can't. So the purpose of this kitchen economics branch was to reclaim or dispose of condemned canned goods, flour, sugar, rice, beans, prunes, dried peaches, apples, and apricots, kitchen byproducts, bones, fats, drippings, stale bread, swill, empty cans, sacks, burlap, or wrappings from frozen beef, paper, rope, twine, bottles, boxes, barrels, kegs, forage salvage, bran, oats, dead animals, hair. All those things were converted into like those latter things, soap or tallow or dubbin for shoes, hog food, chicken food. Nothing was wasted. So, and when you had a salvaged coat or something like that that's shot up or has holes or dirty, and women in the rear, once it was evacuated and sorted and sent to the rear, women would make slippers and hats, campaign hats, and overseas hats rather, and things like that. So nothing was allowed to go to waste. There was a time when a man coming out of the front lines, infantryman going to the rear for rest, would have to have something in his hand, some piece of salvage, So they made it, and each division had at least, I think, one salvage squad. These were quartermaster men that would be, there were procedures for this, for them to conduct a survey through the battle area and sort these things, and they would make their way back on empty rail cars. There again, the supply coming up with beef for whatever, empty. You're not going to go back empty. They'll go back with sorted, we hope, items to go back. So that's kind of interesting things.
Yeah, absolutely. Like don't waste a trip here. Like we're shipping up food, but that empty train car needs to come back with salvage equipment, so nothing gets wasted. Oh, that's amazing. Yeah. Like I've read about somewhere in another book that the AEF was working to become like as self-sufficient as possible. So this really ties into, like, don't waste anything. That coat
Yes.
could be repurposed. I love the idea of the trench coat coming up again, where it was ankle length at one point. So they wound
Yes.
soldiers didn't like it that long. It was cumbersome. So they wound up cutting it at the knees, and that extra fabric became the overseas hat that
Overseas
troops
hats. Yeah.
wear. That I'm not sure if the Army still uses those today. They did in my time. So
Yeah. Yeah. I think the Army now has got berets, but
is it okay? Still the
I
beret?
think you know what I'm an Air Force guy. We still have the overseas caps.
Yeah, yeah, and I'm old enough to say in my day we wore woodland camouflage, so like I'm very dated. So
Well, I predate that. I started when I started in 1979. It was fatigues, just the green,
wow,
green
wow,
fatigues. Yeah.
wow, that's
So
amazing.
yeah, old, long time ago.
I know, and I mean, no, certainly, I get you. Like, I'm at
Yeah, yeah.
where I'm like, I don't know what kind of camouflage you crazy kids are wearing these days. So,
Yeah, I don't know what they do anymore.
oh my god,
Oh, I want. Can I cover one thing? I got
yeah,
one more
please,
figure from this reduce or from this salvage
yeah,
from April 1918 through March 1919. The value of the recoveries. This seems low to me, but what do I know, right? The value of the recoveries $856,643.01. So one that shows you Army accountants are careful.
right down to the
That's
penny.
right. But yeah, so then that was substantial back then. Obviously, that's a lot of money. So anyway,
Yeah,
I
no,
just wanted to bring that
absolutely.
figure out.
While we're here, those could we go back to the garden service? Like, I just recently, and I mean, like, within the last few weeks, I just heard that, like, the British Army, that they had gardens behind, in the rear of the front line,
Yeah,
that troops would maintain, and that as the Americans came in and the war was moving, these areas weren't necessarily abandoned, and so the Americans took them over. I mean, now you've added that, like, American women were coming in and running those gardens. Like, so can you speak more about that? Like,
yes, and you're right. That what happened was there was a lot of ground lying fallow because of the French farmers of necessity being inducted or volunteering, having to fight. And there was these other gardens that the other units had made that were unoccupied. So the United States, again, as a savings measure, so we don't have to ship a bunch of turnips and carrots from the United States, are going to rot by the time, require tons of ice or what have you.
right,
We'll grow what we can in the theater, and so they had the garden service, and there was, I think, a garden service regiment. And it was 1918 they started as quartermaster. It was originally it was a lot of men who probably were not fit. Maybe they were wounded or they had, for whatever reason, they were not fit for active combat. So they were sent to the Garden Service Regiment, the Garden Service companies, and they did just that. Um, Cultivated what they could and sent them back and sent the food to the soldiers. It was to provide, to save on shipping space and to provide healthy and fresh augmentation to their diet. Initially, it was about 150 men. It was later augmented by a lot of women. I forget the number, but they came from the United States in the summer and they helped out and they did a good job helping with that. And there was we even had a garden services technical headquarters in Versailles. Now, talk about that would be a nice assignment.
really, yeah,
And they would handle the provision of tools, which we had a lot of vacant, tools sitting around too, tools and seedlings and seeds and technical information on how to grow asparagus or whatever. And there again, these men did a needed function. They were told to go do it, and they probably didn't win any medals for that, but earn any medals, I should say. But yeah, the garden, and you don't hear about that garden service, but yeah.
amazing, amazing. Just like it, the salvage operation, the Harvard's idea of the competition for unloading the ships, women coming over, buying local when you can, like this. I think the one thing that I've thought about with your book is the AEF, we think more often of the frontline units and how they were fighting and constantly trying to adapt to the battlefield. And we went from doing the human wave attacks to moving in smaller groups and more maneuver warfare. That same spirit, and thanks to your book, like I see the same thing happening in the services of supply, like constantly trying to adapt, constantly trying to innovate. Like, these guys are, the unloading of the ships isn't going that well. Well, how about this? Whoever unloads ships the fastest gets to go home first. And like,
right.
and like,
right, exactly. Yeah. And it's true. It's a learning curve. Just like as you said, the fighting was an extremely sharp learning curve. And we didn't do so badly given the time we had, but that's a whole other 3 or 4 shows, right? As you probably have already gotten into. But and then the same thing with this is a learning curve, and they did, and I could talk about the meat a little bit, the cold storage plants, which had to take this meat, and then it was all, if you read, and I don't think that we brought it out too much in the book, but if you look in the quartermaster literature, they experimented. How are we going to, we're going to ship 3 sections of shipment, and this one is going to be deboned, one is going to be like this and covered this way, and another is going to be this way. By the time it gets to the end user, rate how the food is, let us know, so they're constantly trying to experiment. Should we take the bones out? Should we leave them in? How do we rate? Do we wrap it in burlap and then the paper? Do we, all that stuff? So, and that's just one little example, bones, meats, which of course we got a chart in the book that tells you how many pounds of bacon and pork, and I forget what it is that's required for 40,000 men. But anyway, one thing, a big thing, but I mean, one mundane thing, and they were experimenting with that. And so you can multiply that by everything else. How do you unload a ship? Well, how do you load it so that the first thing you unload is something you need, and you didn't load that first, so you can't get the first thing you need until everything, that kind of thing.
Right. No, amazing. Yeah, like I'm just thinking of quick examples here, but you don't load I don't know, socks in front of like beef, that probably needs to come out first and go right into storage before you start unloading clothes or something like that. So yeah, amazing. So there's a lot of testing, evaluating, measuring going on, trying to find best practices. No, that's really amazing. Going into a different topic here, still tied to the services of supply. So we've got the various stages of medical care are also addressed in bullets, bandages, and beans. That's the bandages part. So let's say you've got a doughboy. He's wounded in combat and he suffers something traumatic like the loss of a leg or a massive wound. Can you walk us through the various levels of medical attention that soldier would be processed through?
Right, sure. The first thing, of course, might be self-care where he could.
Yep.
Then each regiment, we'll talk an infantry regiment.
Sure.
Each regiment had a medical detachment, sanitary detachment. Sometimes you hear sanitary, like a sanitary train. What's that? Medical sanitary. But each regiment had this detachment, and men from that detachment would be parceled out to the line companies and could act as aid men. So they would, if fortunately, they may be able to get to the man and help him. Maybe the man's not horribly wounded, but he can't fight. He can make his way back. But anyway, maybe the first stop might be a battalion aid station where there would be a surgeon. Again, he's not going to perform any surgeries. He's probably not going to perform, he's not going to sew up a stomach or a gut or something like that, but they stabilize a person and get them back to the regimental, either clearing station or aid station. From there, each division had 4 field hospitals and 4 ambulance companies. And the men would work their way back. And I believe that when you're looking at the 4, like one might be for wounded men, one might be for sick men. Typically, one might be a gas field hospital.
Okay.
And there would be another one that would augment or support the reserve or whatever. And the same thing with the ambulance companies. There's like kind of a 4th one, but it would all be kind of working. Nobody would be sitting around twiddling their thumbs in a Meuse-Argonne, for example. So anyway, they come back to there. And again, they're always evaluated along the way. Dressings, initial dressings may not be touched for a while, but the more you goof with that. But anyway, it's outside my scope. I'm not a doctor, but then they work their way back. They'll go to an evacuation hospital, and evacuation hospital would be a little bit, each stage of the way back, maybe more capabilities, more care. Of course, a division had labs and things like that. But as you go further back, you have more facilities for labs or X-rays or what have you, operations, and all the way back to the base hospitals, which were bigger. I think again we have to look at the book. I forget the required bedding space and things like this, and numbers of men, like 200 enlisted men or 35 officers. I forget. And then all the way back to general hospitals, and then of course back to the United States where they could perform. And some wounded men, badly wounded men, were sent back as soon as they were able to travel. Others maybe stayed there until the end of the war, But yes, that's kind of the, and it's always been that way. World War I, World War II, the same. There's a hierarchy of flow for a wounded man.
Yeah, wow, amazing though. But so obviously all of that has to get set up as well, before these battles start taking place.
Yeah. Think about too and I don't know that we covered it in the book, but each stage, for example, a field hospital, ambulance companies, each stage, again, nothing's going back forward without more dressings, from the evacuation hospital back to the regimental or the division field hospital. Litters. You got to send litters back. Otherwise, pretty soon you have no more litters. You have more stretchers. So you think of these things, you don't think of them, but then they start piling up outside the evacuation hospital, and they don't have any in the front lines or the battalion aid station or what have you. So yeah, all this stuff's got to be thought of, how to keep things moving back and forth.
Yeah, it's a lot. It's a lot. It's a lot to keep.
Somebody thought of all of it. Yeah.
Wow. So interestingly, is it's established, and you make the distinction in your book that we always think of the first AEF fatalities in World War I as the 3 infantry soldiers in the first division. However, you point out that there were actually other AEF fatalities before those 3 infantrymen were killed.
Yes.
Can you speak about them?
Yes. And typically when we talk about the first men killed in action, I'll read the names: Corporal James Gresham, Private Thomas Enright, and Private Merle Hay, members of Company F, 16th Infantry Regiment, 1st Division. They were killed on a raid on November 3rd, 1917. But actually before that, and what's a combat casualty versus, you died by as a result of enemy action. So there were 3 men who were killed. There were Dr. Lieutenant William Fitzsimmons, Privates Rudolph Rubino Jr., Oscar C. Tugo, and Leslie G. Wood. 4 men. All were members of Base Hospital 5. That was the Harvard Medical Unit. So the men originally came from there, sponsored by the Harvard School. They were killed in a German air raid on their hospital. It was, as I said, Base Hospital 5 at my French is non-existent. It's Dens Camier on September 4th. So about 2 months before the 1st Division soldiers were killed. I'm unaware of anybody else dying before that in action, but these were the first Americans serving in the American Army. They were supporting British Army, but they're in the American Army, and those, to my knowledge, were the first 4 men killed.
Yeah.
There's some, I think, might have been nurses. There were nurses present, female Army nurses present. I don't know. Someone may have been wounded. I've forgotten right now, but yeah, so they were there. The women, American nurse women, were among the first to see action.
Wow, right there with the guys close enough to be bombed by German planes. So that's great. It's really awesome that you mentioned that. It's part of the base hospitals and it's part of the SOS. But it's great to hear that so that these guys get their unfortunate recognition as well. But
right, yes. Mm-hmm.
Now on to a little bit lighter topics. So to give listeners an idea of more of the frankly wonderful details you've uncovered for the book, can you tell us about the coffee roasting detachments and the female vigilantes that are mentioned?
Yes.
And I've got to say, for the listeners out there, this is an exaggeration, but imagine being mobilized by the Army and you get to be basically a Starbucks barista. So,
yeah. So, of course, the French, they liked their wine, and the British wanted their tea. The Americans wanted their coffee. And so, there again, in order to save space from the United States shipping, right, we bought coffee in Europe. And I think by the autumn of 1918, we had purchased almost the entire production of Europe, 16 million pounds.
That's wild.
That's a lot of coffee. And they were green beans, green. So what do? We're going to roast them. We're going to grind them and roast them. So they set up a coffee roasting plant in, let me see. I forget where it was, but it's near Paris. Again, tough duty.
Right.
But they built a coffee roasting plant. And to staff it, they had 2 coffee roasting detachments sent from the United States in the summer and I think early fall. And interestingly, many of these men, and I'll discuss this later in regard to precision instrument repairmen, but many of these coffee roasting guys into 2 different detachments had experience either as brokers. They bought and sold coffee. They were some way related to coffee. They owned a store. They, some way related to coffee, and so they were in charge of this. And by the armistice, they were actually grinding. It was the largest grinding and roasting facility in Europe. And by the armistice, they were putting out 1.5 million rations a day. So that's a lot. It's a lot of coffee. But yeah, it's a coffee roasting plant number 1. Again, something you never hear about. And it had a lot of civilians working in that. But they were in charge of these American military men. Again, many of whom had coffee experience. So here's an example. Another example. I'll do the vigilantes, and I'll come back to them.
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay. So in 1918, in the streets of Paris, if there appeared supposedly some American women who would be looking around, right? Looking around, and if they see an American boy talking to a lady of the evening or somebody of ill repute or what have you, they would go up to that person and say, "Does your mother know what you're doing? Does think about your mother, think about your home, think about this." And this would be enough often to dissuade the doughboy, or at least let me go to another street or something,
Right.
And so nobody knows who these women were. Nobody knows where they came from. The provost marshal decried any knowledge of these women, and so we don't know. Maybe it was apocryphal, but it's kind of an interesting little thought that you can't escape the long arm of the long arm of home.
Yeah, exactly. Does your mother know what you're doing? Yeah.
Does your mother know what you're doing? Yeah. So, and back to these, the Army. As soon as a person was drafted, even when they registered, right, you put down what you did and what your occupation was. And when you're drafted, and you're more discussions, what's your experience? What have you done? What do you want to do? Do you want to be a coffee roaster? Or but so there's always an evaluation, and we all hear the weird things, where the surgeon ends up on a floor. Well, that's an exaggeration, but a man is not fit for where they put him. Right. But I found 5 different detachments. I will read what they are real quick, just because they tickle me to no end. I love this stuff. The Surgical Instrument and Typewriter Repair Unit 1, Detachment of Camera Repairmen, Optical Repair School Ordnance, the Detachment of Surgical Instrument Repair Unit, Sanitary Corps, Medical, and the Headquarters Band Instrument and Typewriter Repair Detachment. So these are 5 units that went overseas. Each of them, it's descriptive, right? So the surgical instrument repair, these are men that dealt with surgical instruments. At the time, you write small, sharp things that cut, clamps, things of this nature. They wear out, they need to be fixed, they need to be sharpened. Camera repairmen, obviously you had still cameras, motion picture cameras, and of course, aerial cameras, which this is the beginning of aerial reconnaissance, and very important, very valuable, very important. Typewriters, every unit, every company had a small office force and a typewriter, and the headquarters had a lot of typewriters. So all this stuff in bands, all this stuff had to be repaired. And I looked at all these different detachments. They vary from, like 79 enlisted men, 14 men, 12 men, 9 men, and so on. So 32 men. I tried to find what each of these men did for a living. And, obviously a lot of them were related directly to that surgical repair instrument manufacturer, supply, repair. A lot of typewriter maintenance men that worked in Connecticut in like the Remington or Underwood factory, Smith Corona.
Okay. Yep.
So these men found their niche, right? They got placed where they were needed. And once in a while you find, like, well, there were some tailors. Well, they're used to fixing little machines and things of this nature. So you got a lot of different, it's fascinating to me that these men were kind of put where they were needed and where they fit.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of them ended up in a medical department, repair shop 1 in Neuilly, France. So, I find it interesting they had these little units and, what did you do? Well, I repaired tubas, and had to be done,
Yeah.
But,
yeah. I didn't know the Army, like yeah, you think of like the typewriter, like you mentioned units, but but that's how paperwork was done back then. It was on type. So yeah.
Absolutely. And there again, well, what happens if you're missing a couple screws? That's got to be sent through this huge logistics chain. So you can buy, threaded one, screw one each,
right.
That kind of thing, things you don't think of, but that's got to happen. It's got to be there. If you need it, you need it.
Yep. Yeah, no, absolutely. Absolutely. Oh my God. And I haven't thought of the nomenclature. Yeah. Of the military parts.
It's a whole other.
Yeah. Wow. So amazing. So like all of this went on like behind the lines and like we've been mentioning, like this is the not so sexy work of running an army if if we can even use that comparison. But this is like it's not glamorous at all. So like we've talked about, the war ends, of course, on November 11th, 1918. But for the services of supply, like those doughboys still need to be fed daily, still need uniforms. And while the weapons are now no longer in use, now everything is going to turn around, and those guns, they're going to start being shipped home. So like now the services of supply, they need to completely reorient. We're no longer like putting things together to ship to the front. We're getting them so we can start breaking them down and shipping them back home. So can you tell us about the process of like the services of supply shutting down in the years after World War One?
Yeah, and you pretty much described it. Everything stops and has to reverse direction. Now we have the Third Army, of course, is going into Germany as part of the Army of Occupation of Germany.
Yep.
That continues there, and they've got a separate base section to continue that. But everything else, the vast majority of the 2 million people we have over there have to come back. And so it's the same thing in reverse. Now you have your railheads picking things up and bringing things. And of course, it's never fast enough for the men. They always want to come back, and it's understandable. And they want to know, when do we go home? When do we eat? When do we go home? That's what and most of those have to do, by the way, with services of supply, transportation to go home, and food.
Right.
So everything's moving back. You have the reverse process. You have the rest camps on the way out, Pontenizin and the others on the way out to Brest and to all these other ports, and all the way back. And so that had to kind of, there were actually ships stopped in mid-ocean and said, the guys on board didn't get a chance to go to France. They got to turn around and come back. And now everything starts coming back. The ships go back the other way and bring back things. So, and as things were phased down by the summer, late summer, maybe July, August of 1919, for the most part, the services of supply in France was shut down, continued until 1922 or 23 for Germany. So you still had that. They still had people coming and going. They still had supply, same issues. I need to feed myself. And toward the end, of course, they were buying and selling on the German market, but still things had to be coming in. So they still had the same issues. They learned a little bit. They learned a lot. And so that helped. So it went really into 1919 was the big effort where it stopped. Yeah.
Wow. Amazing. Wow. What a fascinating book. And I think this adds lot to the literature of the AEF. Like I think you take your book and tie it in with like Dr. Ed Lengel's book, like To Conquer Hell, the Meuse-Argonne.
Yeah, excellent.
I think the two like complement each other. Like, hey, you're reading about what's going on the front line. Well, here's what was going on behind, and how the SOS was always scrambling, always innovating, trying to get things up, trying to improve the supply situation for American troops for the Dole.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, so fascinating book.
Thank you.
Yeah, so folks, the book is Bullets, Bandages, and Beans: United States Army Logistics in France in World War One. Links to it will be provided in the episode notes. So buy the book at your local bookseller. Well, I'll also link out. I will find in your bibliography Haygood's book, and I'll link that out too.
Yeah, I've got it on my shelf, but it's downstairs.
Yeah,
but it's a good. It would be a good one to look at. There's also Charles Dawes, who's General Dawes, who later became vice president, head of the Inter-Allied Purchasing Board. He has a 2-volume reminiscences that cover that kind of thing that might be boring to some, but that's how things were done. Anyway.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. Pete, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. I greatly appreciate it.
Well, it's my pleasure. I'm sorry, Al. Al would have made this even better, but I'm glad to be here. I'm very happy that you sought us out. Thank you.
Cool. Thank you. And any last bit is I guess I should have asked already, but like you guys have any ideas on your next project or anything like that?
Yeah, we do have a couple of ideas, and we're going to discuss that probably today. See what we want to do. We've been doing well so far, and our writing styles, I think, complement each other. Our ideas, how we want to approach it. We're never at loggerheads. We've never met. We've never even met. It's all by phone or online, what have you. So yeah, we're working on another one.
Oh, awesome. Well, I look forward to it. Pete, thanks again for coming on the show.
Thanks very much, Mike. Thank you.